Richard's real enemies were not his peasants, but his barons. They hated Richard's guts. They hated his arty-farty way of life, they hated his wife, who was foreign, and they hated the way he kept them out of power. But most of all, they hated his policy of peace with France. War was their only hope of making money and increasing their influence. In 1387, the barons, led by Arundel, Gloucester and Warwick, openly rebelled against him. They may even have deposed him for a few days. And when they grabbed power, they mercilessly tortured and executed the young king's closest friends and advisors. The wicked barons started squabbling amongst themselves about which of them was going to be king, and Richard was eventually able to regain power. The amazing thing was not that Richard eliminated these three barons 10 years later, but that it took so long to do it. And when he did finally get rid of them, he refused to let the bloodshed run any further. He certainly didn't torture anyone. If anything, perhaps Richard was too soft on his enemies. For in 1399, one of them, Henry of Lancaster, returned from exile, stole his throne and murdered him. Richard is branded a tyrant, and yet it could be said that by bringing peace abroad, by ending the war with France, and peace at home by crushing the baronial opposition, he was acting in the interests of his people. He was, in fact, playing by the rule book. Richard was a victim of propaganda. His successor, Henry IV, had treacherously usurped the throne. Henry had to prove that Richard was a bad king. He called in all the chronicles to check they said nothing good about Richard and nothing bad about himself. And writers like John Gower were terrified into writing absurd eulogies to Henry and producing gross defamation about Richard. Gower even goes back through his previous work and changes it to fit in with the new regime. In this book, for example, the Confessio Mantis, which he originally dedicated to Richard II, in this edition, he claims to have dedicated it to Henry. You can see here he's written, "I send this book unto my own lord, which of Lancaster is Henry named." And a bit earlier in the poem, he claims to have made the dedication in 1393. But it's a lie. He couldn't have done, because Henry didn't become Henry of Lancaster until 1399, when his father, John of Gaunt, died and he inherited the title. Gower even seems to recognise the impossibility of the dedication, because he writes here, "I dedicate it to Henry of Lancaster, who, of course, was Henry of Derby at the time." The whole thing is a fiction, designed to make it look as if Gower has been supporting Henry for longer than he has. Political spin was just as alive in the Middle Ages as it is today. I that am curtailed of this fair proportion, cheated of feature by dissembling nature, deformed, unfinished, sent before my time into this breathing world, scarce half made up. Oh, such fun playing Richard III, the archetype medieval tyrannical king. I want to do some more. But since I cannot prove a lover to entertain these fair, well-spoken dames, I am determined to prove a villain. The trouble with Shakespeare's Richard III is that most of it's made up. I mean, Richard didn't even have a hunchback. What, not even a small one? This portrait, painted 35 years after his death, shows him with one shoulder higher than the other. But an X-ray shows that originally the shoulder was lower. The picture was later altered to add the deformity. Yeah, but you wouldn't expect an official portrait to include a deformity like this, would you? Yeah, but we've got contemporary eyewitness descriptions of Richard, and they don't mention any hunchback. Spoil sport! It looks like one of the biggest baddies in history could have been the victim of a smear campaign. But who would have wanted to do that to him?
At the dark heart of the legend establishing Richard III as a monster are two dead children.
When Edward IV died in 1483, he intended his 12-year-old son to succeed him as Edward V.
Someone was needed to act as protector, and Richard, as an able leader and the young prince's uncle, was the obvious choice.
However, the ex-king's widow, Elizabeth Woodville, fancied the job of protector for herself, so she tried to get her son crowned as quickly as possible. Once he was safely on the throne, she and her horde of ambitious, upwardly mobile relatives would be in control of king and country.
Richard foiled the Woodville takeover plot. He placed the prince and his little brother in the Tower of London to keep them out of their mother's clutches, an act most people approved of at the time. No one wanted the Woodvilles, mere commoners, to have that much power. Parliament then voted Richard as protector.
At some point, Richard decided to make a play for the throne himself. We don't know whether he intended this all along or whether he just saw the opportunity and took it. All we know is that a senior bishop suddenly and conveniently announced that the late king's marriage to Elizabeth Woodville was invalid, and that the two princes were therefore bastards and hence, surprise, surprise, ineligible for the throne.
This left Richard as next in line. Bit of luck, really, and he was duly crowned in Westminster Abbey. Most people probably thought it was all for the best. However, at some point the two princes vanished. Nobody knows what became of them, or even if they died during Richard's lifetime. Their probable murder became one of the key planks in building the scaffold on which Richard's reputation hangs twisting in the wind. But even so, our concept of Richard, the hunchbacked monster and tyrant, is a total fabrication. The real man was rather different.
Richard grew up here in the north of England, where he seemed to be more at home than he was in London. Probably the weather. And his brother, Edward IV, obviously knew he could trust him because he gave the 19-year-old the rather tricky job of keeping the wild and woolly north on side.
Records kept in Richard's power base at York reveal him as an effective negotiator, a successful peacekeeper, and a champion of the poor.
Thomas Langton, the Bishop of St. David's, wrote in 1483, "He contents the people where he goes, best that ever did prince. For many a poor man that hath suffered wrong many days hath been relieved and helped by him."
As king, Richard introduced major reforms to the legal system.
Dic mihi terensi accuratius, quantum biberas ea nocte.
For a start, he insisted it should be conducted in English rather than Latin.
Oh, just exactly how much had you been drinking that night, Mr. Jones?
Richard's law reforms were really pretty impressive. He introduced a kind of legal aid for the poor, and he also addressed a very pressing problem. He took steps to make sure that juries weren't intimidated. When Richard made his first visit to York as king, the city put on a hell of a show. The streets were lined with tapestries and arras cloth, and there were pageants and speeches and feasting.
The city also had a whip round, and parting with hard cash is not something people around here do lightly.
Here in the city archives, they've still got the record of who paid what. You can see this is John Newton, Mayor. He's paid £20, that's 2 X's. And elsewhere somebody's paid £30, £20, £10. Now, £10 was a lot of money in those days. It was equivalent, say, to a year's income for a country parson, or 4 to 5 years' income for a labourer. So these people are parting with quite a lot of cash. In fact, some people thought it was a bit too much. You can see down here, Thomas Cater,
he's been put down for £20. That's been very firmly crossed out. You can just imagine the scene, you know. Oh, come on, Thomas, we're going to put you down for £20 then. Come on, lad. No, I haven't got £20. I can't pay it. Well, I'll put you down now for £20. Cross it out. Oh, it'll look bad in the records. I don't care. Nobody's going to see it, are they? Well, we are 500 years later.
And there are other records which prove that the city of York genuinely admired Richard. When news of Richard's death at the Battle of Bosworth in 1485 reached York, the council notes, "King Richard, late mercifully reigning upon us, was piteously slain and murdered, to the great heaviness of this city."
Now, that's not a conventional eulogy. Richard's enemies were now in power, and to be seen to be siding with the late king was potentially suicidal. And yet these men felt so strongly about him they were prepared to put their names to that statement in the records.
So why have we ended up with this view of Richard as an evil monster? The verdict on Richard was written by his enemies. He was defeated in battle and killed by Henry Tudor, who had himself crowned as Henry VII. And in order to justify this illegal regime change, Henry needed to convince the world that Richard was the very epitome of evil. The disappearance of the princes made it a piece of cake. Shakespeare towed the line of Tudor propaganda, and in so doing, created one of our most enduring stage villains.
But I am in so far in blood that sin will pluck on sin. Tear-falling pity dwells not in this eye.
Which brings us to the King of England that no one's ever heard of.
Well, have you ever heard of King Louis, the first and last? No? Well, that's not surprising, really, because he's been kind of airbrushed out. The story starts in 1215, when bad King John was locked in a struggle with his barons. Rather than let them take over the country, he surrendered it to the Pope. The furious barons retaliated by inviting Prince Louis, heir to the French throne, to come and replace him.
John retreated to Winchester. Louis was hailed as king in London and celebrated Mass here in St. Paul's Cathedral. Roger of Wendover wrote in his chronicle, "Louis received the homage and fealty of all the barons and the citizens who were awaiting his arrival there."
For 5 months, John and Louis fought tooth and nail across the country until John lost the crown jewels in the wash and lost his life in a bout of dysentery, leaving Louis as the effective ruler of England.
But of course, the Pope wasn't going to allow that.
And he helped to organize the opposition. Louis and his forces were eventually crushed at Lincoln Castle in 1217. But for nearly a year, he'd run most of England. He'd received homage as king from most of the barons and from the King of Scotland, which sounds pretty much like a king to me. So why doesn't Louis figure in the royal roll call? Perhaps he's not on the list because he never actually had the crown stuck on his head. But then neither did Edward V or Edward VIII, and they're on it. Or is it just too embarrassing to admit to a second French invasion?
The point is, history isn't necessarily what happened. It's very often what somebody wants us to think happened. So I suppose we shouldn't believe everything we're told, even if it's as set in stone as the names of the kings of England.